Who would like to live a long time? I'm seeing some hands up. That's encouraging. If anyone didn't have their hand up, we do have some school counselors and people in the professions who are happy to support. In my work, I kind of sit on a three-legged stool. One of the legs is just community service and ceremony work. I officiate at naming ceremonies, traditional Ojibwe funerals, and everything in between. That's all uncompensated and just in the traditions of our people. Spend about a third of my time doing my actual job, which is professor of Ojibwe, meaning I teach Ojibwe language, history, culture. And I spend about a third of my time writing books, giving talks on diversity, equity, inclusion, tribal sovereignty, language revitalization, and things like that. They're like three strands of a braid. They all intersect with one another. But I'm also trained as a historian, and I've done a lot of historical research, and I've been kind of amazed looking at Native communities at how many people had a remarkably long life. I got to spend a lot of time with the late Archie Mosé, who was born in 1901. He passed away in 1996. Not only was he born in a wigwam, even his children were born in wigwams. He was 12 years old the first time he met a white man. That was an American experience, just not one you often hear about. He was in his 30s first time he saw a car. When I met him, he was in a little modern house watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing really loud. So inspiring to think about how did he get there. And it wasn't just his longevity. He was surrounded by children and grandchildren and a community. In our language, the word for an elder, Gitchiaya'a, literally means a great being. The word for an elderly woman, Mindumuye, means one who holds things together and describes the role of the family matriarch. Age, highly respected in Native communities. And he had a good friend from the neighboring tribe who was Ho-Chunk, sometimes referred to as Winnebago, although that's actually a corruption of an Ojibwe word. And his name was Jim Funmaker. He made it to 102. He was still driving at 102. And he'd get pulled over by the cops once in a while, and he'd tell the cop, "Boy, you look at my license. You see how old I am? I have to speed. I might die before I get there." And the cop would laugh and just let him go. There were folks contemporary that I knew and historical figures too, like the late Chief Buffalo, who was one of the preeminent chiefs in Wisconsin, Roger Jourdain from Red Lake. And these are guys who just made it into their 90s, which is considered a good run now, but not necessarily newsworthy. There are lots of other folks who made it well into their 100s. Nuden Wind, who was also from Red Lake, he ended up being the Grand Marshal for the 4th of July parade in Bemidji in 1976, and he had lived through half of America's first 200 years. It's like, that was pretty cool. These guys, Gagi Gagijik from Warroad and John Smith from Leech Lake, each would have been the world record holder for human longevity had their birth records been authenticated in a colonial system. The formal record holder is actually this woman from France who's quite remarkable herself, made it to 122. But both of Gagi Gagijik and John Smith would have eclipsed her record. That's pretty cool. They had to know something. This might sound like a strange place to start, but if you check out these books, which are non-Indigenous authored works, that are trying to answer the questions about how do you outlive? How do you have a remarkably long life? What does it take to be an outlier? You know, the Good Life is about the big longitudinal Harvard study about human happiness and longevity, where they're following generations in families and checking in with them every year for health checkups and interviews. And you get a very different perspective if you ask someone, what was the last 100 years like, that you do if you ask someone each year for 100 years in a row, what's going on. All of them speak to some remarkable things. So it's not just eat right and exercise, although do eat right and do exercise. But all of them in different ways speak to the importance of relational health, healthy relationships. And that can take many forms. It can be with a spouse, friend, child, children, community, friends, so many different iterations. But that healthy relationships pay huge dividends to longevity. In my view, these guys are starting to catch up to my guys, the elders that I was just showing you something about a minute ago. Because each, in their way, was directly connected to community, culture, ceremony, and if you think about it as human beings, until about 10,000 years ago, which in the span of time is not that long, all of us lived in villages. All of us had earth-based worldviews. All of us lived in community. All of us harvested food together and put it into a common food cache, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. We survived saber-toothed tigers and cave bears, not because we outcompeted the person in the next cave or accumulated more resources than them. We survived those things because the person in the next cave loved us. And they would intervene if we needed something. So as humans, it's literally in our DNA. We are hardwired to need connection, belonging, and love. And the Western world tells us to pursue individualism, competition, and materialism, and it has us at odds with our most fundamental needs and yearnings, and the things that contribute mightily to our best chances at a long, healthy, happy life. I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow, Abraham Maslow, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He kind of shared this one with the rest of the world. You've got basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, and there's kind of a tier, and at the very tippy top, you can do a pirouette around your individual self-actualization. What a lot of people don't realize was that Maslow, although he was trained as a psychologist, played anthropologist, and he actually got his information from a study of the Blackfeet. He left them as nameless informants, and he changed things. So for the Blackfeets, self-actualization, the healthy human part, starts at the base. And building up from there, you go to community-based actualization as an engine that feeds relational health and cultural perpetuity. So that even if something happened to somebody's primary relationship, caregiver, whatever, the cultural perpetuity and community health is enough to buoy that person for a good chance at a long, healthy, happy life. When you put those things next to each other, you can see what Maslow changed. And when you put it in context with all of the other things we've been learning, you can see that it may have been a disservice to change it in the ways that he did. Finally, the scientists are catching up with our elders. We do need healthy relationships and healthy communities. Where we're going with this is that we are in a diverse world. It is only going to be more diverse. We're on our way to 10 billion people on planet Earth, and then the human population begins to drop. We're only 20 years away from the British population being majority racial minorities. That's Great Britain. In the United States, the majority of the documented kids are people of color. That's who's here. It doesn't matter, Democrats, Republicans, build the wall, don't build the wall, be mean to everybody and try to throw them over a fence. Like, that is who is here. And if you want the people you care about to have a good chance at a long, healthy, happy life, and you understand that relational health is central to that, it means we better figure out how to get along. We better figure out how to show people what it looks like to heal, what it looks like to reconcile, instead of what it looks like to fight one another, to fight over just us, not them, as opposed to justice. And saying it's one thing and doing it's another. If you are focused on your individual self-actualization, it's easier to be in a just us frame of mind. But when you have a community-based frame, it is easier to think about the importance of reconciliation, healing. And we can see that we're really in the same canoe, so we should start paddling together so we can go somewhere. Part of the work is zooming out a little bit to get some perspective, and then zooming in so we can start paddling. That Indigenous folk have some remarkable examples and ongoing practices at relational health. It's what our ceremonial life is about. It's what our cultural practices are. In the middle, there's a picture of me tapping a maple tree with one of my daughters. We have a custom when a baby's born where we actually take the placenta and afterbirth out into the maple forest and we bury it by a maple tree, which is considered the tree of life. And when we go out in the spring to open our sugar bush, my kids and grandkids are out there, and I have both, and we are making offerings at the tree of life, and all the placentas for all my children and grandchildren are in the same grove of trees. And I feel so connected to the woods, and to the kids, and to the grandkids, and to my parents, and to my grandparents. And boy, cutting a tree down sure feels different. And so there's just an opportunity to do something that we all need to do. I've come to realize that happiness and health are not destinations that someday we get to, including health for a nation or the world. These are practices that we have to practice at. You put a ring on your finger, and it does not mean happily ever after, although you say that. It means I promise to practice at happily ever after with my person. And if we're honest, some days better than others. But if you keep practicing, you do become happier. It's the same with health. You can't get all your workouts in for your entire life in one trip to the gym. I'm like, got it all done, don't have to worry about that anymore. Right? You have to keep going. And you have to keep practicing. And if you do become healthier. And you do become stronger. And so I can't promise you like the perfect solution for all of the isms, but I can promise you that practice does get you closer to that goal. We do need to practice. We need to practice at healing. We need to practice at reconciling. We need to practice at happiness. We need to practice at relational health. And all of these things contribute. When you flash forward to today, you will notice that Native people are lagging in longevity data, right? This is the aggregated data, and I'm not going to take time to do a whole breakdown on everything wrong with how we collect data. Tell you a couple things, though. The 2010 census said there were 5 million of us. The 2020 census said there were 10 million of us. We didn't have that many babies that fast. Although I think I did my part. But they let you check more than one box. There are all kinds of school districts, programs, and municipalities going, we got way more natives than I ever thought we did. How can this be? What do we need to know? What do we need to do? It also means that a lot of the native population is especially multiracial, so they may not look the stereotypical part. Some are a full-blooded native person. They look super brown. Some look black. Some look white. Some look racially ambiguous. You can't tell. But people experience racial dynamics by color, but also by culture, and also by consciousness, how we see ourselves. When I think about, and this doesn't even tell you everything, that's everybody who self-identifies as Native. If you look at the enrolled tribal citizenry, or if you look by geography, you see some other even more stark and disturbing information, like a life expectancy at Pine Ridge for men of 48, and women 52. And they tell you to save money for retirement. The Native population is as complex as any other. How come this data doesn't jive with those elders I was showing you a couple minutes ago and what we know about relational health? And I think the answers are pretty obvious without taking a deep dive onto history lessons. There was not just genocide. There was not just diseases. There was an effort, and there is still an ongoing effort to disconnect people from the engines of their relational health. Residential boarding schools, this is Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who said, "Our goal is to kill the Indian in order to save the man." Schools that kept cemeteries for babies at Haskell, at Carlisle, at so many others. By the way, the US government could not build enough schools fast enough to enroll the 20,000 Native kids every year they were putting into the schools, so they subcontracted a lot of the work to churches who ran a significant percentage of the schools. And they did lots of damage. Even today, our educational system is still very colonial. When we talk about things like white privilege, we're not talking simply about things like financial advantage. But if you're a white kid in the United States of America, you will have the privilege of going to school and having your race widely represented in who does the teaching. A white kid will get a white teacher at some point. Your race will be widely represented in the stories that are taught, in the examples of what awesomeness looks like. I went to school, I never once had a Native teacher all the way through K-12, college, master's, up to my PhD, I had my first Indigenous educator. And that is the most common experience for Indigenous folks. What's going on in the school systems? 87% of educational standards that mention Native anything are stories from before 1900. We're reinforcing the narratives of erasure. 1 out of 3 Native kids has been adopted or fostered out of their family of origin. Until the Indian Child Welfare Act, 99% placed into white families. After the Indian Child Welfare Act, 74% placed into white families. I think someone would be upset if 1 out of 3 white kids was removed from their families and if most of them were placed into a totally not white home. Even if the fostering or adopting families were really kind and loving and had the best of intentions. All of this stuff is part of a pattern. Those are the things that put the schism that got us to this disconnect between what the data is showing you and what we could see, not just from anecdotal evidence, but a lot of other things about the importance of relational health.